When two officers arrested her, they had no idea they would face her again, this time as the judge deciding their fate. Please, before we dive into this wonderful story, don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment on this channel. It was a sunny afternoon in Fort Collins, Colorado. The park buzzed with life. Children played, joggers paced along the trail, and families picnicked under the shade of tall oak trees. Amid this peaceful scene, a black woman sat on a bench near the pond, a thick hardcover book resting on her lap. Her name was Rosemary, a well-respected attorney taking a rare moment to escape her demanding schedule. She was deeply engrossed in her reading when the sharp screech of tires broke her concentration. A police cruiser pulled up to the curb, catching the attention of several onlookers. Two officers stepped out, their stern expressions radiating authority. Their eyes immediately locked onto Rosemary, the only person sitting alone in the area. "Ma'am, may we speak with you for a moment?" one officer called out, his tone more suspicious than concerned. Rosemary glanced up from her book, her calm demeanor unwavering. "Of course," she replied, carefully closing the book. The second officer approached, his tone clipped. "We got a call about some suspicious activity in the area. Mind telling us what you're doing here?" Rosemary raised an eyebrow, clearly puzzled. "Suspicious activity? I'm just sitting here reading." She held up the book to emphasize her point, but their scrutiny did not waver. "Can we see some ID?" the first officer demanded. Her pulse quickened, but she remained composed. "I don't understand. What's the reason for this?" "It's routine," the second officer replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. By now, a small crowd had gathered, murmuring among themselves. Some looked curious. Others exchanged uncomfortable glances. Sensing the imbalance in the interaction, Rosemary sighed and reached into her bag, pulling out her wallet. She handed over her driver's license. The first officer took it, scanning the information with unnecessary intensity. "Rosemary Johnson," he read aloud, his tone almost mocking. "What's your business here, Ms. Johnson?" Rosemary took a deep breath, trying to maintain her patience. "I live in the city. I came here to enjoy the park." "Is that a problem?" The officer's lips tightened. "We'll see." He handed her ID back, but didn't leave. Instead, they continued to hover, asking questions that felt more like an interrogation. "Do you always carry a book like that around?" one officer sneered. "Are you alone here? Or are you waiting for someone?" the other added, his hand resting deliberately on his belt. Rosemary had handled countless tense situations in courtrooms, but this felt different. The power dynamic was stark, and their tone carried an edge she recognized all too well. Still, she chose her words carefully. "I'm not answering any more questions unless you tell me what I'm being accused of," she said firmly. Her refusal seemed to trigger something in them. The first officer stepped forward. "Don't get smart with us," he snapped. "We're just doing our job." "And I know the law," Rosemary replied, her voice steady. "I'm not breaking it by sitting in a public park." Reasoning with them was futile. The first officer grabbed her arm. "You're resisting," he declared, though Rosemary hadn't moved. "What are you doing?" she exclaimed, startled. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder. A man pulled out his phone to record the scene. "Stop resisting," the officer repeated, louder this time, as if performing for the audience. Rosemary's heart raced as the cold metal of handcuffs snapped around her wrists. She tried to stay calm, even as humiliation and frustration burned inside her. The officers led her toward their cruiser, ignoring the growing questions from onlookers. As the car door slammed shut, Rosemary turned her head toward the crowd, locking eyes with a young woman holding up her phone. For a brief moment, there was an unspoken exchange, a silent plea to document the injustice unfolding. But as the cruiser pulled away, Rosemary knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. Inside the cramped back seat, her mind raced. She had spent years defending clients, standing up for justice, and navigating the legal system. Now she was on the other side of it. The absurdity of the situation struck her, but there was no humor in it, only anger. The ride to the station was suffocating silent, save for the crackle of the police radio. Rosemary stared out the window, her reflection merging with the passing scenery. Her wrists ached from the cuffs digging into her skin. At the station, the situation only worsened. The booking process was invasive, humiliating, and designed to strip her of her dignity. She was fingerprinted, photographed, and led to a small holding cell under relentless fluorescent lights. "Enjoy your stay," one officer said smugly as he shut the cell door. Rosemary sat on the cold bench, her resolve hardening. This wasn't just about her, it was about justice. And she wasn't going to let this injustice go unanswered. Her hands clasped tightly in her lap, Rosemary replayed the events at the park over and over in her mind. How had such a peaceful moment spiraled into this? The answer was as clear as it was bitter: prejudice. Hours passed before anyone acknowledged her. A young officer approached her cell, holding a clipboard. "Miss Johnson, you've been charged with resisting arrest and obstructing a peace officer," he said flatly. "On what grounds?" Rosemary asked, her voice sharper than she intended. "You can discuss that in court," he replied before turning away. Rosemary exhaled slowly, forcing herself to think strategically. She knew the charges were flimsy, but she also understood that the fight ahead wouldn't be easy. Cases like hers rarely were. Eventually, Rosemary was released on bail. As she stepped outside the station, the cool night air hit her like a wave, a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere inside. She spotted her colleague and friend Francesca waiting by the curb. "Rosemary." Francesca rushed over, her face a mixture of relief and concern. "Are you okay?" Rosemary nodded, though her body betrayed her with a slight tremor. "I'm fine," she said, though the word felt hollow. As they drove away, Francesca kept glancing at her, waiting for her to speak. Finally, Rosemary broke the silence. "I'm not letting this slide, Francesca. Not this time." Francesca's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking I'm tired of this happening," Rosemary replied. "I have the tools, the knowledge, and the resources to fight back, and I will." That night, Rosemary sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by legal pads and open books. She worked tirelessly, outlining a civil rights lawsuit against the officers and the department. Her hands shook, not from fear but from a simmering determination. As days turned into weeks, the community began to rally around her. The video of her arrest, shared by the young woman in the park, had gone viral. Messages of support poured in from people across the country, many sharing their own stories of injustice. With each email, phone call, and comment, Rosemary's resolve grew stronger. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had been silenced, humiliated, or dismissed. Even as she prepared for the courtroom battle, she couldn't have predicted how justice would take an unexpected turn. The weeks following her arrest were a whirlwind of emotions and relentless work. At first, her law firm was hesitant, concerned that her public case might overshadow their carefully cultivated reputation. But Rosemary didn't flinch. She calmly explained that this fight wasn't just about her, it was about setting a precedent. The viral video did more than spread her story. It sparked conversations across the city and beyond. Footage of Rosemary, calm yet defiant as the officers forcibly led her away, became a symbol of resilience in the face of injustice. Reporters reached out for interviews, but Rosemary turned them down. She wasn't interested in media attention. Her focus was on building a case that would hold the officers accountable and expose the systemic flaws that allowed such behavior to persist. At night, when the world went quiet, the weight of the situation crept in. She replayed the arrest in her mind. The dismissive tone, the handcuffs, the murmurs of the crowd. She thought about how easily things could have escalated further, and the thought made her stomach churn. But it also fueled her determination. One evening, as she sifted through her research, Francesca stopped by with takeout. Rosemary barely looked up from her laptop as Francesca placed the food on the table. "You've been at this for hours," Francesca said gently. "I don't have a choice," Rosemary replied without missing a beat. Francesca sat across from her, studying her face. "You know this is bigger than just a legal battle, right? People are looking to you now." Rosemary closed her laptop and finally met her friend's gaze. "I know," she said, her voice steady. "That's why I can't afford to lose." Her preparation was meticulous. She combed through similar cases, pulled precedents, and gathered evidence to dismantle the officer's claims. She enlisted the help of trusted colleagues, building a legal team that shared her passion for justice. But her fight wasn't limited to the courtroom. Rosemary made it a point to engage with the community. She attended town halls, listened to others who had experienced similar injustices, and even spoke at a local college about the importance of accountability. One afternoon, as she walked to her car after meeting, a stranger approached her. "Miss Johnson," the woman asked hesitantly. "Yes." "I just wanted to say thank you," the woman said, her voice cracking. "For standing up to them. For standing up for all of us." Rosemary felt her throat tighten. She managed a small smile. "I'm just doing what I can." The community's support was a double-edged sword. It empowered her, but it also heightened the pressure. She couldn't let them down. Then one day, her attorney called with news. "The officers you're suing have filed a motion to dismiss the case," he said. Rosemary expected as much. It was a standard move to delay the process. But as her attorney explained the next steps, he hesitated. "Rosemary," he said cautiously, "you should know something else. You've been assigned as the judge for one of their cases next month." The irony was staggering. Rosemary leaned back in her chair, processing the revelation. She had spent weeks preparing to fight these officers in court, and now fate had handed her an entirely different kind of justice. For a moment, she wondered if she could do it, sit on that bench, and remain impartial. But then she thought about everything they had put her through, about the people depending on her to make a stand. This wasn't just a coincidence. It was an opportunity to show what real justice looked like. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as people filed in, finding their seats. The case was a routine misconduct hearing involving two officers accused of using excessive force in an unrelated incident. To most observers, it seemed like just another day in the justice system. Officers Carter and Daniels sat at the defendant's table, wearing their uniforms like armor. They leaned toward each other, speaking in low tones, their expressions a mix of indifference and boredom. For them, this was routine, a hurdle to clear, a case to brush aside. When the door to the judge's chambers opened, the room fell silent. Rosemary stepped onto the bench, her black robe flowing behind her. She moved with purpose, her expression calm, yet commanding, and took her seat. Glancing at the defendants, she noticed their immediate reaction. Officer Carter's face paled, his eyes widening in shock. Daniels shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening as recognition dawned on both of them. It was her, the woman they had humiliated and arrested at the park. Rosemary let the moment settle over the room before speaking in a clear, steady voice. "This court is now in session. Please be seated." The officers sat stiffly, their composure visibly faltering. Carter whispered to their lawyer, who nodded but kept his focus on Rosemary. For the first time in weeks, Rosemary felt the upper hand. Yet, she reminded herself that this wasn't about revenge. As a judge, her duty was to remain impartial, and she was determined to uphold that standard. As the attorneys delivered their opening arguments, Rosemary maintained her professionalism. She listened intently, taking careful notes. Occasionally, her gaze flickered toward the officers, noticing the tension in their shoulders and the subtle fidgeting of their hands. During a recess, Carter and Daniels retreated to the hallway, their voices low but agitated. "How is she the judge?" Carter hissed, barely containing his frustration. "This has to be a setup," Daniels muttered, shaking his head. "It's not a setup," their lawyer interjected firmly. "It's a coincidence, and you need to stay focused. She's not the enemy here, your actions are." When court resumed, Rosemary remained composed, ensuring the proceedings were conducted fairly and efficiently. Yet her presence clearly unsettled the defendants. Each time she addressed them, they shifted uneasily, their confidence eroding. At one point, Carter stole a glance at her. His expression wasn't one of defiance, but something closer to regret, as if he was beginning to grasp the gravity of their actions. By the end of the day, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Rosemary struck her gavel with finality. "We will reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m., she announced. As the room emptied, Rosemary lingered at her bench, organizing her notes. She could feel the weight of the officers' stares as they hesitated near the door, seemingly debating whether to approach her. In the end, they left quietly, their steps heavy with the realization that this was far from over. The next morning, the courtroom was packed. News of the unexpected twist had spread, drawing a larger crowd. Some were there out of curiosity, others to support Rosemary, though they knew her role required impartiality. Rosemary entered with the same calm composure as the previous day, her robe flowing behind her as she ascended to the bench. The attorneys wasted no time diving into their arguments. The prosecutor methodically presented evidence against the officers, including testimony from the victim of the excessive force incident. "Your Honor," the prosecutor stated, "the officers' actions were not a mere lapse in judgment, but a blatant abuse of power. Their behavior reflects a pattern of disregard for the people they are sworn to protect." Rosemary nodded, taking in every word as her pen glided across her notepad. Her focus was unwavering, even as the defendants shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. The defense attorney rose to counter, his tone measured but strained. "Your Honor, while we acknowledge the incident, we argue that the situation escalated due to factors beyond the officers' control. Their intent was not malicious, and we believe this case lacks sufficient grounds for punitive measures." As the arguments continued, Rosemary couldn't ignore the parallels between this case and her own experience. The excuses and justifications felt all too familiar. Yet, she pushed her personal feelings aside, determined to let the facts guide her judgment. When it came time for witness cross-examinations, the tension in the room deepened. The prosecutor called the victim, a young man named Goldberg, to the stand. His voice trembled as he recounted the night he was tackled to the ground by the officers during a routine traffic stop. "They didn't even give me a chance to explain," Goldberg said, his eyes darting nervously between the attorneys and the officers. "It felt like they'd already decided I was guilty." The courtroom buzzed with low murmurs as the prosecutor questioned the young man on the witness stand. "Before you even had a chance to explain, did you resist their orders at any point?" the prosecutor asked firmly. "No," Goldberg replied, his voice resolute. "I was scared, but I followed every instruction. It didn't matter. They had already made up their minds." The room grew silent as the defense attorney stood to cross-examine him. He attempted to undermine Goldberg's testimony, picking at small inconsistencies, but the young man held his ground. Every word painted a vivid picture of a routine traffic stop that had spiraled into excessive force. Rosemary watched the proceedings closely, her expression unreadable. Then the moment everyone had been waiting for arrived. The defendants, Officers Mickey and Daniels, were called to testify. Officer Mickey was the first to take the stand. His hands fidgeted as he glanced nervously toward Rosemary, who sat composed on the bench. After swearing the oath, he faced the prosecutor. "Officer Mickey," the prosecutor began, "you've been accused of using excessive force during this incident. Can you explain your actions that night?" Mickey hesitated, his gaze darting to Daniels for support. I thought the situation was escalating," he stammered. "I made a judgment call." "And do you believe your actions were justified?" the prosecutor pressed. Mickey shifted uncomfortably. "At the time, yes. But looking back, I could have handled it differently." The prosecutor raised an eyebrow. "Handled it differently how?" "By not tackling an unarmed, compliant individual to the ground." Mickey opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His silence spoke volumes. When Daniels took the stand, his demeanor was no less strained. His attempts to justify his behavior only reinforced the prosecutor's argument, exposing a refusal to take accountability. Rosemary listened carefully, her face betraying no emotion. Yet inside, she felt a potent mix of frustration and pity for the officers who had recklessly abused their authority. As the day wore on, the evidence against the officers grew insurmountable. The prosecutor's closing argument delivered a resounding message: the abuse of power by law enforcement must be confronted. Today, this court has the opportunity to send a message that such actions will not be tolerated. The defense attorney's closing statement, by contrast, felt hollow. Their arguments lacked conviction, and even the defendants seemed resigned to the likely outcome. Rosemary adjourned the hearing with a steady voice. "A ruling will be delivered next week," she announced. The courtroom emptied slowly, but Mickey and Daniels lingered near the exit, their faces pale and drawn. For the first time, they seemed to understand the weight of their actions and the reality of the consequences ahead. A week later, the courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back wall, pens poised to capture every word. This was no longer a simple misconduct case. It had become a symbol of the larger fight for justice and accountability. Rosemary entered with her characteristic calm, ascending the bench as the room fell silent. "The role of law enforcement," she began, her voice steady but firm, "is to protect and serve the community with integrity, respect, and fairness. When those entrusted with this responsibility abuse their power, they erode public trust and cause harm far beyond the immediate victim. This case has laid bare the consequences of such actions." She paused, her eyes scanning the room. Mickey and Daniels sat at the defense table, their heads bowed under the weight of her words. "The evidence has demonstrated that officers Mickey and Daniels acted with unnecessary force, disregarding the protocols they were sworn to uphold. Their actions were not only unjustified but indicative of a troubling pattern that must be addressed." Rosemary outlined the consequences: mandatory suspension without pay, participation in extensive retraining programs, and a formal disciplinary record that would follow them throughout their careers. Her ruling was firm but fair, balancing accountability with the opportunity for reform. As the gavel struck to close the case, the officers rose. Before leaving, Mickey hesitated and turned toward Rosemary. "Your Honor," he said, his voice barely audible, "I'm sorry." The words were a small step, far from enough to undo the harm, but perhaps a beginning. Rosemary nodded, acknowledging the sentiment without offering absolution. True change, she knew, would come through actions, not apologies. Later that evening, Rosemary attended a community meeting at a local recreation center. The room was filled with people eager to share their stories and frustrations. An older woman approached her after the meeting, gripping Rosemary's hand tightly. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "What you did in that courtroom, it means the world to us." Rosemary smiled softly. "This is just the beginning. We have so much more work to do." In the weeks that followed, the case sparked conversations far beyond the city. Community leaders, law enforcement, and activists began working together to push for reforms emphasizing transparency and accountability. For Rosemary, this journey wasn't about personal vindication. It was about ensuring that others wouldn't have to endure what she had. The fight for justice was ongoing, but moments like these reminded her that change, though slow, was possible. As she stood on the courthouse steps one afternoon, watching a group of young activists gather for a peaceful rally, she felt a flicker of hope. The system wasn't perfect, but with enough voices, it could be pushed toward progress. And that, she thought, is the kind of justice worth fighting for. If you believe in the power of accountability and change, subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire action and reflection. Together, we can work toward a fairer, more just world.